So we're here once again at the Nordic Game Jam, where game designers from the IT University and elsewhere come to make a game in just, well, I don't know, 48 hours, about so. And I'm here with Greg Costykian, classic and famous game designer of both role-playing games and video games. How did you end up here at the Nordic Game Jam?
Okay, so I was first in Denmark a few years ago when I was a guest of honor at Festival, which is a role-playing convention in Aarhus. And I worked for Nokia for many years and was back and forth both to Finland and to Denmark on a number of occasions. So I guess Anders needed a keynote speaker for the event and thought of me, and I'm comfortable here, and I guess they're happy to have me. So,
as we said, we're at the Nordic Game Jam, so there's a lot of indie game developers here. What do you think about the indie scene in general? Where it is now and where it's going?
Okay, so I'm kind of known as the angry middle-aged man of the game industry. I wrote a thing back in 2000 with some other people called the Scratchware Manifesto, in which I inveighed against the iniquities of the conventional retail market and said that we really needed to have small development teams doing creative work in defiance of the conventional industry. And at the time, the Scratchware Manifesto was kind of treated as a joke by people in the industry. I remember Jessica Mulligan writing about it on her blog and saying that the people who wrote this were obviously like naive outsiders, and I had to kind of email her and say, Jessica, it's like, I wrote that. And then a few years later in 2005, I gave a speech at the Game Developers Conference in which I basically said we needed to blow up the industry and start from scratch, and got a standing ovation from game developers there. And sometime later wrote an article for The Escapist, which you can still find if you look for it, entitled Death to the Games Industry, Long Live Games, basically making the same point. And I then went and did a foolish thing. I founded a company called Manifesto Games, which was intended to try to provide a viable marketing channel for independent games, which was a triumph of optimism over reality, and spent the next 3 years drawing no salary and trying to get the company off the ground and failing miserably. So yes, obviously I have a strong investment in independent games. I think independent games are cool and about one of the few hopes for the future of games in general.
But what is it with comparing indie games to big AAA games? What do you think is wrong with the AAA games, to sum up the manifesto and your article?
Okay, when you are dealing with budgets in the tens of millions of dollars and development teams in the hundreds, the people who fund these things become extraordinarily cowardly. So in essence, to get something funded in the conventional market at the moment, it absolutely needs to be in one of a handful of genres that they know how to market, and it, any kind of game design innovation is almost prohibited, and in most cases, you pretty much have to deal with a franchise, either number 7 in a series of games that have already been successful, or based on some kind of movie or TV license. And even when, say, EA goes off and says, "Oh, we're going to do a whole series of games based on original IP," they mean that they're going to have titles that are not, number 7. They're not going to have a 7 after the title, but it's still going to be essentially the same gameplay you can find in any other title. If you go and look at the bestsellers list for 2010, I think you will find that it's like shooter in a franchise, sports game in a franchise, sports game in a franchise, and I think Super Mario Brothers Wii is on the list there. And Super Mario Brothers was a great game in 1992 or whatever the hell it was released, and I guess it's interesting that you can now play it with a Wii controller, but I don't consider that exactly exciting.
So, if there's one thing that you'd like to tell the games industry, is basically take chances, take risks.
Yeah, absolutely. Everything is a risk. The game industry, for some reason, has been more willing to take risks on technology and on business model than they have on design, which strikes me as foolish. So,
how did you go from making role-playing games, tabletop games, to making video games?
Like a lot of people who move from the tabletop industry to the video game industry, it's largely because you have to make a living. Yeah. But the immediate way I did it, in fact, was back in the late 80s, there was a commercial online service called Prodigy, which was headquartered in Westchester, New York. This was kind of before the internet was open to commercial use. And they had several million subscribers who were paying to get access to their service. And they wanted to do a series of games. And my friend Eric Goldberg, the co-designer of Paranoia, had previously done a game for a market test of what became Prodigy, which was the only thing that was remotely popular on the service at the time. And they asked him whether they could get him to redevelop it. And he brought me in to essentially do all the writing for the game. And it was actually the first online game to attract more than 1 million players, which sounds more impressive than it actually was, because Prodigy had at that time 2 million subscribers, and there was very little of, if you're interested in games, there was not much else on the service at the time. So,
When you're sitting down and designing either a role-playing game or a video game, what's the main difference?
The main difference is that when I am designing a tabletop game, within a week or 2 weeks at most of inception, I have something I can sit down and play. And so the vast bulk of the development time is spent in iterative refinement, and by the time I'm done with it, I have something that I think is quite solid and good. Whereas in a digital environment, I sit down and I write a design spec, and 6 months or 9 months or a year later, we have something that we can play, and we play it and we decide that it sucks. And at that point, we have maybe a very short amount of time to do any kind of iterative refinement before we run out of time and budget, which I think is why so many video games suck. It's really hard to get the time and the energy and the budget to be able to polish to the degree that's really necessary.
Anything particularly that when you look back at your history, both with video games and role-playing games, that any project you felt most passionate about?
Well, I mean, probably Paranoia is the game I had the most fun working on, both because it's a very strange game and because I was then working with a lot of very amusing and interesting people. In fact, one of the main contributors to the game, Ken Ralston, who I guess his name is on the box of the second edition, later went on and became kind of famous video game designer, the designer of Oblivion, among other things.
How did Paranoia came to be in the first place?
Okay, so there was a local area games master in New York by the name of Dan Gelber, who I used to play with a lot. And he actually came up with the original idea for Paranoia. And it was really designed to kind of suppress and sit on a player whose playstyle he found obnoxious, because it would enable him as a games master basically to have absolute power over his players. And I played the game with him, and I said, Dan, this is really funny. Can I do something with it? And we made a deal, and I went off and wrote a manuscript, which was roundly rejected multiple times, until I was then, like a year later, working for West End Games, which is a tabletop role-playing and board game publisher in New York, and got them interested in publishing it, and was joined then by my friend Eric Goldberg, who was also instrumental in the original design for the game. Yeah, that's about it. And, Dan, I'm still in touch with Dan. Dan still gets a third of whatever small royalties at this point the game still produces, and he's quite happy with the results. So.
Do you think actually? I talked to a couple of people on Twitter about Paranoia just a couple of days ago, and we talked about the concept of a multiplayer video game. Do you think that Paranoia, as a concept, would work either as an MMO or a video game?
I have a hard time seeing how it would work as a kind of typical single-player game. As an MMO, possibly. Part of the problem there is that MMOs are kind of, ever upward grind going on forever, and Paranoia is a game of, rapid death and humorous death. So, I mean, yeah, there are certainly ways to do it. Whether there's a way to do it that would actually make money is another question, but, yeah.
Looking at games like, for example, Braid, which got raving reviews, sold well, And over the last year, we've seen games like Minecraft, for example, that's totally blown the top of the indie market. Well, have you played them? What do you feel about them?
Of course. Well, I mean, Jonathan Blow was practically the poster child for the independent games movement, right? He spent 3 years of his own time, invested his own money, and developed that game. And it's a brilliant game, absolutely brilliant game. And the first indie game to, be a top 20 Metacritic title. It's fantastic. Minecraft is a style of game I don't actually like, so it's hard for me to be too enthusiastic about it. But it's cool that people are being successful doing something out of the norm. And another one that has been kind of a surprise hit recently is Amnesia: The Dark Descent, which came from nowhere to do over 100,000 unit sales. Yeah.
That's a good example. Paradox had their big event last week. They're investing in games like Salem, the MMO with permadeath, Gettysburg game with RTS.
Yeah, so this is a kind of an argument I've had with some other people in the indie field. Is I actually view companies like Paradox or Matrix, which is another publisher of computer war games, as being somewhat indie. They're not distributing through conventional retail primarily, although they do have a retail SKU of some of their products, and they're selling into a niche audience. And I don't know that Paradox considers themselves indie. They consider themselves old school designers doing grand strategy games, right? But they are doing something that's not in the norm of conventional retail. So. I'm, by the way, a big Paradox fan and playing a lot of Victoria 2 at the moment. So.
Just to finish up, we talked a lot about indie games. We talked a lot about board games and the relationship to video games. Looking back, what's your favorite so far indie game? Most innovative, most inspiring to you as a game designer?
Well, okay. There's a weird game called The Shiva, which is designed. It's a graphic adventure. It's designed by a fellow in New York by the name of Dave Gilbert, who has since done some much better, in some ways, graphic adventures. The Shiva is, extremely retro graphics, but it's a adventure game about a crime-solving rabbi. Not something you're normally going to see. I thought that was very charming.
All right. Thank you very much for your time.